Homeless girl broke into mafia boss's car for warmth during a blizzard. I'm keeping you now. The wind howled through the steel canyons of Northbridge, a living thing with teeth made of ice. It tore through the thin fabric of Evie Carter's coat, seeking the warmth of her skin like a predator hunting prey. It was 10 at night, or perhaps 11. Time had lost its meaning, measured only by the numbness creeping up her fingers and the burning ache in her toes. The blizzard had descended upon the city 3 hours ago, turning the familiar grime of the streets into a white, blinding purgatory. Evie kept her head down, her chin tucked into the unraveling wool of a scarf she had found in a donation bin 2 weeks ago. She moved with the shuffling gait of the exhausted, her boots skimming over the slick pavement. They were cheap boots, 2 sizes too big and split at the seams, allowing the slush to seep in and soak her socks. Every step was a squelch of freezing water, a reminder that her body was losing the battle against the elements. She had tried the shelter on 4th Street first. The line had wrapped around the block, a snake of shivering bodies huddled against brick walls, waiting for a miracle that would not come. When she finally reached the front, the heavy metal door had slammed shut. Full capacity. The words were not spoken, just written on a cardboard sign taped to the glass. She'd tried the church basement on 9th next, but the power was out on that side of the city, and the dark hall was already packed with families clinging to each other in the gloom. Now she was drifting. There was no destination, only the primitive instinct to keep moving, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. She paused in the doorway of a closed electronics store, pressing her back against the glass, inside. Dark screens reflected the swirling snow. She breathed into her cupped hands, trying to capture a fraction of heat, but her breath was a ghost, vanishing instantly in the gale. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy things that barely obeyed her commands. She rubbed them together, flinching at the lack of sensation. Frostbite was not a distant threat anymore. It was a silent companion walking beside her, waiting for her to sit down. Evie pushed off the glass and forced herself back into the wind. She turned down a narrow alleyway behind a row of upscale restaurants, hoping the vents from the kitchens might offer a momentary reprieve of warm air. The alley was dark, shadowed by high walls, but the snow reflected the ambient city light, casting everything in a surreal, gray glow. That was when she saw it. It was a black SUV, massive and sleek, idling near the back entrance of a high-end Italian steakhouse. The vehicle looked like a beast sleeping in the snow, its dark paint gleaming under the security light. But what caught Evie's attention was not the luxury of the machine. It was the white plume of exhaust billowing steadily from the tailpipe. The engine was running. She stopped, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She looked around. The alley was empty. The snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, obscuring the ends of the street. No one was coming out of the restaurant's back door. The driver was nowhere to be seen, likely inside waiting for a client or picking up an order. Evie took a step closer. Drawn by a magnetic pull she could not resist. Heat. The car promised heat. She could see the windows were fogged over from the inside, a sure sign that the climate control was blasting warm air into the cabin. She imagined what it felt like in there. Dry, hot, safe. The longing was so intense it made her knees weak. Just for a minute, she whispered to herself. Her voice was a cracked rasp that the wind snatched away. She did not intend to stay. She certainly did not intend to steal. She just wanted to stop shivering. She wanted to feel her toes again. If she could just sit in that warmth for 5 minutes. Maybe she would gather enough strength to make it to the subway station 6 blocks away. She crept toward the vehicle, expecting a shout, a siren, or a dog barking. There was only the roar of the wind. She reached the rear passenger door on the side facing the wall, hidden from the casual view of anyone looking out the restaurant windows. Her hand, red and raw, hovered over the handle. It would be locked. Rich people always locked their doors. It was a universal rule. She pulled the handle. The mechanism clicked, smooth and silent, and the heavy door swung outward. Evie froze, her eyes widening. It was unlocked, a mistake, an oversight, a miracle. A gust of warm air escaped the cabin, hitting her face like a physical caress. It smelled of expensive leather, faint cologne, and heated oxygen. It was the most beautiful smell she had ever encountered, without letting herself think about the consequences, without considering the danger of entering a stranger's car in a city known for its crime. Evie slipped inside. She pulled the door shut quietly, the heavy thud sealing out the roar of the storm. Silence. The sudden absence of the wind was shocking. The interior was dimly lit by the dashboard lights in the front, casting a soft blue hue over the black leather seats. It was spacious, cleaner than any room she had slept in for 6 months. She sat on the edge of the back seat, afraid to touch anything, dripping melted snow onto the floor mat. The heat wrapped around her instantly. It penetrated her damp coat, her soaked jeans, her frozen skin. It made her scalp tingle and her eyes water. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her body shaking violently as the adrenaline faded and the temperature shock set in. She had a blanket tucked under her coat, a moth-eaten thing she had swiped from a laundromat dryer 2 days ago. She pulled it out and wrapped it tight around her shoulders, curling her legs up onto the seat. She knew she should not put her dirty boots on the leather, so she kicked them off, letting them fall to the rubber mat below. She tucked her feet under the hem of her coat, groaning softly as the blood began to flow back into her extremities. "I will count to 300, she told herself. 5 minutes, then I will leave. She started counting in her head. 1, 2, 3. The seat was incredibly soft. The engine hummed a low, soothing vibration that traveled through the frame of the car and into her bones. It felt like being held. It felt like the life she used to have, before the eviction, before the job loss, before the man with the heavy fists who had convinced her she was worthless. 50, 51, 52. Her eyelids grew heavy. The heat was making her drowsy, a narcotic pull dragging her down into the dark. She fought it for a moment, blinking at the fogged window. The snow piled up against the glass outside looked like white noise. It was a barrier between her and the cruel world. 100. Evie rested her head against the cool glass of the window. Just for a second. The rhythm of the engine was a lullaby. Her thoughts began to fracture, dissolving into nonsense. The terror of the night, the hunger gnawing at her stomach, the fear of the police, it all receded, pushed back by the overwhelming, blessed warmth. She did not reach 300. Her breathing leveled out, deep and slow, her hand, clutching the dirty blanket, relaxed. She fell asleep. A small, dark shape huddled in the corner of a kingdom that did not belong to her. She did not hear the crunch of heavy boots on the snow outside. She did not hear the back door of the restaurant open and close. She did not hear the beep of the key fob unlocking the front doors. The driver's side door swung open, letting in a blast of Arctic air that swirled through the cabin. Evie did not wake. She was too deep in the abyss of exhaustion. A man slid into the driver's seat. He was big, his shoulders filling the space, his presence instantaneous and heavy. He slammed the door shut, cutting off the cold. He was on the phone, the device pressed to his ear, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded attention. "I do not care what the excuse is," the man said. He spoke with a precise, clipped accent that hinted at an education paid for with old money, but there was an edge to it, a roughness that spoke of violence. "Tell Santoro that if he moves product through the docks again, I will burn the shipment and send him the ashes in an urn. Am I clear?" He paused, listening, his gloved hand gripping the steering wheel. "Good. Handle it." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. He reached for the gear shift, ready to pull away. But then he froze. He heard it, a sound that did not belong in his car. It was a soft, rhythmic wheeze. A snore? No, just the heavy, congested breathing of someone deeply asleep. Luca Moretti went still. His hand moved from the gear shift to the inside of his tailored wool coat, his fingers curling around the grip of the semi-automatic pistol holstered beneath his arm. He did not turn around immediately. He checked the rearview mirror, but the interior was too dark, and the windows were too fogged to see clearly. He did not panic. Men like Luca Moretti did not panic. They assessed, they calculated, they acted. "Who is in my car?" he demanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a blade, sharp, cold, and cutting, in the back seat. Evie jerked awake. The sound of his voice was like a gunshot in the small space. She gasped, her limbs flailing as she tried to sit up, tangling herself in the stolen blanket. Her heart slammed against her throat, choking her. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the door she had entered through, her eyes wide and terrified in the gloom. "I am sorry," she cried out, her voice shrill with panic. "I am sorry. I did not mean to fall asleep." Luca twisted in his seat, his movement fluid and fast. He looked over the center console, his eyes adjusting to the shadows. He saw a small figure huddled against the leather, a mess of layers and wild hair. She looked more like a pile of laundry than a threat. He did not draw his weapon, but his hand stayed close to his chest. "Unlock the door." Evie fumbled blindly for the handle, her fingers slipping on the plastic. "Please, just let me out. I was just cold. I'm leaving." Outside, shapes moved in the snow. Luca's security detail. They had seen the movement in the car, seen their boss turn. Two men appeared at the windows, their hands already reaching for their waistbands, their faces grim masks of anticipation. One of them tapped the glass with the barrel of a gun. Evie saw the weapon through the fogged glass and let out a strangled sob. She stopped trying to open the door and curled into a ball, shielding her head with her arms as if expecting a blow. "Wait," Luca ordered. His voice was loud enough to be heard through the glass. He held up a hand to his men, signaling them to stand down. They hesitated but lowered their weapons, stepping back into the swirling snow. Though their eyes remained locked on the back seat, Luca turned his full attention back to the intruder. He reached up and flipped on the interior light. The sudden brightness was blinding. Evie flinched, burying her face in her knees. "Look at me," Luca said. It was not a request. Evie trembled, her breath coming in short, hyperventilating gasps. She slowly lowered her arms and looked up. Luca Moretti stared at her. He was a man in his late 30s, with a face carved from granite and eyes the color of flint. He was handsome in a severe, terrifying way. He wore a suit that cost more than Evie had earned in her entire life, beneath a coat of dark wool. He looked like power. He looked like death in a well-tailored suit. He looked at Evie, and for a moment, he was silent. He saw a girl who could not be older than 25. Her face was smudged with dirt, her lips were chapped and blue, and her skin was pale with a sickly, translucent quality. Her hair was a matted tangle of brown under a knit cap. She was drowning in an oversized, filthy coat. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. "You broke into my car," Luca stated flatly. "I found it unlocked," Evie stammered, tears leaking from her eyes. She wiped them away frantically with the back of a dirty glove. "I swear, I did not break anything. I needed to get warm. It is so cold out there. I thought I was going to die." Luca's eyes narrowed. He scanned the back seat. He saw the wet patches on his Italian leather where her snow-covered clothes had soaked through. He saw the puddle of dirty water from her boots on the floor mat. He saw the frantic terror in her eyes. She had no weapon. She had no bag. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a blanket that looked like a health hazard. "Who sent you?" Luca asked. "No one," Evie cried. "I do not know who you are. I am nobody." "Nobody breaks into a Moretti car by accident," Luca said, his voice lowering to a dangerous rumble. "Did Santoro send you? Are you supposed to plant a bug? A tracker?" Evie stared at him, genuine confusion mixing with her fear. "I do not know who that is. Please, mister, I used to be a waitress. At the diner on Main. Before they closed, I lost my apartment. I have nowhere to go. I just wanted 5 minutes of heat. Please do not hurt me." She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. As she did, the sleeve of her coat slipped down. Luca saw it, around her wrist, stark against the pale skin, were the yellow-green remnants of old bruises, finger marks. Someone had grabbed her, hard, a long time ago. He saw the way she flinched when he shifted slightly in his seat, the way she made herself small, trying to disappear. She was a stray, a kick dog expecting another kick. Luca felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was not pity. Pity was a useless emotion that got men killed. It was something sharper, curiosity, and beneath that, a dark, possessive anger that he could not quite explain. He looked at the window. The blizzard was raging outside. The wind was screaming, driving the snow horizontally. If he threw her out now, she would be dead by morning. The temperature was dropping to 10 below zero. She had no proper boots, no proper coat. She was already hypothermic. He could see it in the sluggish way her pupils tracked him. He could open the door. He could drag her out by her collar and leave her in the alley. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. She was a liability, a variable he could not control. But he looked at her eyes. They were wide, the color of whiskey in the light, terrified but holding a spark of desperate will. She had broken into a mafia boss's car to survive. That took a kind of courage. Even if it was born of desperation, Evie reached for the door handle again, her hand shaking. I will go right now. I promise I will never tell anyone I saw you. Stop, Luca said. Evie froze. Luca looked at her, his gaze heavy, physical. He felt the instinct rise up in him, ancient and undeniable. He was a man who owned things. He owned the city blocks. He owned the politicians. He owned the silence of the night. When something fell into his lap, he did not throw it away. He leaned back in his seat, his leather gloves creaking softly. He watched her with the predatory stillness of a wolf deciding whether to kill or to keep. If you open that door, Luca said softly, the wind will freeze the tears on your face in 30 seconds. Your heart will stop before sunrise. You know this. Evie stared at him, her lip trembling. She knew it. She had felt the cold reaching for her heart all night. I have no choice, she whispered. You have a choice, Luca corrected. He turned his body fully toward her, resting his arm on the back of the passenger seat. The interior light cast deep shadows over his eyes, making him look like a demon offering a deal at the crossroads. You can get out, he said. You can take your chances with the storm. I will not stop you. Evie's hand tightened on the handle. She looked at the swirling white chaos outside, then back at the warm, safe interior of the car. Or, Luca continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a vibration that she felt in her chest. You can stay. Evie blinked. Stay? I am not running a charity, Luca said. I do not give free rides. If you stay in this car, if you let me take you out of this alley, things change. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his presence fill the air between them. He looked at her bruises, her dirt, her shivering frame. He wanted to clean her. He wanted to feed her. He wanted to see what she looked like when she was not terrified. The thought was irrational, dangerous, and overwhelming. If you stay, Luca said, locking his eyes with hers, you belong to me now. Evie's breath hitched. She understood the implication. She understood that he was not a good man. Good men did not have bodyguards with guns. Good men did not look at women with that kind of dark, consuming hunger. He was dangerous. He was a monster in a suit, but he was warm. She looked at the door handle. Cold death. She looked at Luca. Warm danger. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I mean exactly what I said, Luca replied. I keep what I find, and I found you. He waited. He did not move. He let her feel the reality of the situation. He saw the war in her eyes, the instinct to run battling the instinct to survive. Evie let go of the door handle. Her hand dropped to her lap. She pulled the dirty blanket tighter around her shoulders, shrinking into the seat, surrendering to the gravity of him. I do not want to die, she said. Luca watched her for a long moment. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Dark and possessive, he reached for the gear shift. Good, he said. He signaled to the men outside. They holstered their weapons and moved toward the accompanying vehicles. Luca put the SUV into drive. Sit back, he ordered, his eyes checking her in the rearview mirror one last time. We are going home. As the car pulled out of the alley and into the blinding white of the city streets, Evie leaned her head back against the leather. The heat wrapped around her, heavy and sedating. She was terrified of the man in the front seat, terrified of what she had just agreed to. But as the numbness in her fingers began to fade into a painful prickling, she knew she had made the only choice she could. The storm raged outside, but she was no longer part of it. She was inside. She was kept, and for the first time in a long time, she was warm. The drive to the heart of the city was a blur of white noise and motion, a surreal transition from the freezing purgatory of the alley to the hermetically sealed luxury of the SUV. Luca drove with a casual, terrifying competence, one hand resting lightly on the wheel while the massive vehicle cut through snowdrifts that would have swallowed a lesser car whole. Evie sat rigid in the back seat. The heat that had initially felt like salvation now felt oppressive, heavy with the scent of leather and the man in front of her. She kept her hands tucked into her sleeves, afraid to touch the pristine upholstery, afraid to leave a smear of grime on the world she had invaded. She watched the back of Luca's head, the way the streetlight sliced across his dark hair, the tension in his broad shoulders. She was not a guest. She was something else. Kept. The word rattled around in her skull, bouncing against her exhaustion. It sounded like something you did with a stray cat, or a secret. They descended into the belly of the city, the SUV gliding down a ramp into a subterranean parking garage beneath a glass spire that vanished into the storm clouds above. The garage was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the gray world outside. It smelled of concrete and money. Several other black vehicles were parked in a row, and as Luca brought the SUV to a halt, 3 men stepped out from the shadows of a pillar. Evie flinched, shrinking back into the corner of the seat. These men were big, dressed in dark coats, their eyes scanning the vehicle with professional paranoia. Luca killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Stay close to me," he commanded, his voice low. He opened his door and stepped out. Evie scrambled to follow, her frozen boots fumbling on the sleek running board. She landed on the concrete with a wet slap, clutching her stolen blanket around her shoulders like a shield. The men approached, their expressions hardening as they saw her. One of them, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, stepped forward, his hand drifting toward his waist. "Boss," the man said, his eyes flicking over Evie with undisguised suspicion. "We did not know you were bringing company." It was not a welcome. It was a threat assessment. Evie could feel their judgment like a physical weight. To them, she was a security risk, a bag of trash that had somehow rolled into their sanctuary. She lowered her head, the shame of her condition burning her cheeks. She knew what she looked like. She smelled of the street, of unwashed clothes and desperation. Luca slammed the car door shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He did not explain. He did not apologize. He simply walked around the front of the car and came to stand beside Evie. He did not touch her, but he placed his body between her and his men, a solid wall of dark wool and dominance. "She is with me," Luca said. The words were simple, but the tone was absolute. The scarred man paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is she... Do you need us to..." "She is under my protection," Luca cut in, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Evie's arms stand up. The atmosphere in the garage shifted instantly. The hostility did not vanish, but it transmuted into something else. Caution. Fear. Before, Evie had been an intruder they could toss back into the snow. Now, she was property. Valuable property. To touch her without permission would be an act of war against Luca himself. The men stepped back, their postures straightening. "Understood," the scarred man said, dipping his head. Evie looked up at Luca, stunned. He was not looking at her. He was staring down his men, ensuring the order had taken root. For months, she had been invisible, or worse, a target for harassment and cruelty. Now, with 3 words, this stranger had drawn a circle around her that no one dared cross. It was terrifying to be claimed so completely by a man she did not know. Yet a traitorous part of her chest loosened. For the first time in a year, she was not the prey. "Come," Luca said to her. He turned and walked toward the elevator bank. Evie hurried to keep up, her boots squeaking loudly on the polished concrete, the sound echoing her intrusion with every step. The elevator ride was a silent ascent that made her ears pop. When the doors slid open, Evie forgot to breathe. She had expected an apartment. This was not an apartment. It was a fortress of glass and stone floating above the city. The penthouse was vast, an open expanse of dark wood floors, modern furniture, and shadows. The only light came from the floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the entire space, framing the blizzard outside. From this height, the storm did not look deadly. It looked beautiful, a swirling vortex of white over the glittering grid of Northbridge. Evie took a hesitant step forward and immediately stopped. She looked down at her feet. A puddle of dirty slush was forming around her boots, staining the pristine wood. "I am dripping," she whispered, horrified. "I am getting everything dirty." Luca walked past her, unbuttoning his coat. He tossed it onto a leather armchair with a casual disregard for its cost. "It cleans," he said, not looking back. "Take off the boots." Evie balanced on one foot, then the other, prying the sodden leather from her feet. She left them by the door, two sad, misshapen lumps of brown against the sleek elegance of the entryway. She peeled off her wet socks, shivering as her bare feet touched the floor. Luca was already moving toward a hallway on the left. He gestured for her to follow. He led her into a bathroom that was larger than the entire room she used to rent before her life fell apart. It was all slate tile and chrome, with a shower enclosed in glass that looked big enough for 3 people. "Shower," Luca said. "Use whatever you find." He turned to the cabinets, pulling out towels thick enough to be blankets. He set them on the granite counter. Then he paused, looking her up and down again. His gaze was clinical, assessing the damage, but it lingered on the layers of filth that hid her shape. "Leave your clothes in the corner," he ordered. "I will burn them." Evie's hand went to her throat. "They were all she had. I do not have anything else," she stammered. Luca turned and walked out of the bathroom without a word. Evie stood there, trembling, listening to his footsteps recede. Was he leaving her there, naked? A minute later, he returned. He carried a bundle of fabric which he dropped onto the counter next to the towels. "Put these on," he said. "They will be big. Make it work." Then he left, closing the heavy door behind him. The lock clicked, not from the outside, but simply the sound of the latch engaging. Evie was alone. She stared at the door for a long time before she moved. Her fingers were stiff as she unbuttoned her coat, then the layers of sweaters beneath. She peeled the clothes off her body like shedding a dead skin. The smell of unwashed humanity filled the small, steamy room, making her gag. She stepped into the shower and turned the handle. Hot water hit her like a physical blow. She gasped, her knees buckling, and slid down the glass wall until she was sitting on the tiled floor. The heat was intense, stinging her frozen skin, turning her pale flesh bright red. It was painful, but it was the most incredible feeling she had ever known. She sat there for a long time, letting the water hammer against her back. She watched the water swirling around the drain. It was gray, brown, black. The city was washing off her. The alley was washing off her. And then the tears came. They started as a tightness in her throat and exploded into racking sobs that shook her entire frame. She cried for the cold. She cried for the fear that had been her constant companion for months. She cried for the shame of standing naked in a stranger's bathroom, dependent on his charity, terrified of his intentions. The steam filled the enclosure, wrapping her in a white fog that hid her from the world, and she let herself break apart. She scrubbed her skin until it was raw. She used a bottle of soap that smelled of sandalwood and cedar, his smell. She washed her hair 3 times, digging her fingers into her scalp to dislodge the grit of the streets. When she finally turned off the water, the silence of the bathroom felt heavy. She dried herself with the plush towels, feeling human for the first time in what felt like a century. She reached for the clothes he had left. They were his. A pair of gray sweatpants that were soft and fleece-lined, and a black t-shirt. She pulled them on. The pants swamped her. She had to roll the waistband 3 times to keep them from falling off her hips, and the cuffs dragged on the floor. The t-shirt hung to her mid-thigh, the neckline slipping over one shoulder. She pulled on the thick wool socks he had provided. She looked in the mirror. Her face was scrubbed clean, pink from the heat. Her eyes looked huge and dark, haunted shadows bruising the skin beneath them. Her wet hair hung in tangles around her shoulders. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes, small and fragile and out of place. She opened the door and stepped out. The penthouse was warmer now, or maybe she was just thawed. She followed the scent of food down the hallway, her sock-clad feet silent on the floor. She found Luca in the kitchen. It was a chef's kitchen, gleaming with stainless steel and dark marble. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. He was standing at the island, ladling steaming liquid into 2 bowls. Evie hovered in the doorway, unsure if she was allowed to enter. "Sit," Luca said without looking up. Evie moved to one of the high stools at the island and climbed up. He slid a bowl toward her. It was soup, thick tomato, rich and red, with a piece of crusty bread on the side. Luca moved to the stool opposite her. He did not eat immediately. He watched her. Evie's stomach gave a violent growl. She blushed, grabbing the spoon. She wanted to be polite, to eat slowly, but her body betrayed her. She ate hungrily, spooning the hot soup into her mouth, the taste exploding on her tongue. It was salty, savory, perfect. Luca pushed a glass of water toward her. His hand brushed against hers as he set it down. Evie froze. The contact was electric. His skin was warm, rough, and dry. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned, her spoon clattering against the bowl. Her eyes snapped up to meet his. She expected anger. She expected the cold, dead look he had given his men in the garage. Instead, she found him watching her with a gaze that was guarded. Yes, but strangely gentle. It was an intimate look, searching and intense. He was not looking at her like a nuisance anymore. He was looking at her like a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Slow down," he murmured. "You will get sick." Evie lowered her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I am sorry. I have not eaten since yesterday morning." Luca picked up his own spoon, stirring his soup idly. "Where are you from?" "Evie." The use of her name startled her. She had not realized he had remembered it from her babbling in the car. "Here," she said softly. "Northbridge. Born and raised. How does a girl from Northbridge end up freezing in an alley behind a steakhouse?" The question was clipped, demanding facts, not sympathy. Evie hesitated. The shame was a thick lump in her throat. I had a job," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was a waitress, and I had an apartment. But my boyfriend, She stopped. She did not want to tell this man about the yelling, the holes punched in the drywall, the way her savings had slowly disappeared into his habits until the rent checks bounced. He was not a good person, she finished lamely. "When I left him, I had nothing. I lost the job a week later. They cut shifts. It just snowballed." Luca listened, his face impassive. He did not offer platitudes. He did not say, "That is terrible." He simply absorbed the information, filing it away. "And you have no family? No one to call?" "My mom died when I was 10, Evie said, looking at the floating basil in her soup. "Dad left before that. It has just been me for a long time." "Just you," Luca repeated. He took a piece of bread and tore it slowly. The violence of the action was subtle, controlled. "Do you know who I am?" he asked suddenly. Evie looked at him. She took in the luxury of the condo, the armed men downstairs, the way he carried himself like a king in exile. "You are Mafia," she said. It was not a question. Luca's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "We prefer other terms. But yes, I run security and money in this city. I ensure that business flows and that people pay what they owe." Evie instinctively recoiled, pressing her back against the stool. The warmth of the soup suddenly felt heavy in her stomach. She was sitting in the kitchen of a man who hurt people for a living, a man who likely killed people. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If you are, why help me?" Luca looked at her. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the marble island. The movement brought his face closer to hers, invading her personal space. "Because you were cold," he said simply. "And because I decided to." It was not an answer that made sense. And yet, looking at him, Evie believed it. He operated on a code she did not understand, a set of rules where whims became laws. He stood up abruptly. Breaking the tension, he took her empty bowl and placed it in the sink. "Come, you need sleep." He led her down the hallway, past closed doors that hid God knew what, to a room at the end of the corridor. He pushed the door open. It was a guest room, but it was nicer than any hotel Evie had ever seen. A queen-sized bed with white linens dominated the space. There was a window with the same stunning view of the storm. "You can stay here," Luca said, standing in the doorway, "until the storm passes. The roads are closed. No one is going anywhere for a few days." Evie walked into the room, her feet sinking into the plush carpet. She turned to face him, clutching the hem of his oversized t-shirt. "Why?" she asked again. "What do you want?" She knew how the world worked. Nothing was free, especially not warmth, especially not from men like him. "What do you want in return?" she whispered, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. Luca watched her. His expression darkened, his eyes dropping to the pulse fluttering frantically in her throat. He stepped into the room. Evie held her breath, her body tensing for flight, though there was nowhere to run. Luca stopped inches from her. He reached out. Evie flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. She felt the rough pads of his fingers touch her chin. He did not strike her. He tipped her head up, forcing her to look at him. His touch was firm, possessive, claiming her attention. He looked down at her, his gaze tracing the curve of her jaw, the flush on her cheeks, the tremble of her lips. The air between them grew thick, charged with a sudden, confusing heat that had nothing to do with the thermostat. "I do not want your money, Evie," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her bones. "And I do not want your gratitude." "Then what?" she breathed. Luca's thumb brushed against her lower lip, a feather-light contact that sent a shockwave straight to her core. He stared at her mouth, his eyes darkening with a hunger he immediately suppressed. "I will decide that later," he murmured. He dropped his hand and stepped back abruptly, as if the contact had burned him. "Sleep," he commanded. He turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. Evie stood in the center of the dark room, her hand coming up to touch her chin where his fingers had been. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified. She was confused. She crawled into the massive bed, pulling the high thread count duvet up to her chin. The sheets smelled of fresh laundry and him. She lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl impotently against the glass. She was safe from the storm, but she was in the house of a wolf, and God help her. When he had touched her, she had not wanted him to stop. She had wanted to lean into his hand. She had felt, for the first time in years, completely and terrifyingly seen. "I am keeping you now." The words echoed in the darkness as Evie Carter closed her eyes, wondering what the price of her survival would turn out to be. The blizzard did not relent. For 3 days, the sky over Northbridge remained a churning wall of white, burying the streets in snow that paralyzed the city's arteries. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of the penthouse, a constant, low-frequency roar that made the silence inside the condo feel even deeper. Evie Carter existed in a strange, suspended reality. The biting cold that had lived in her bones for months was slowly leaching out, replaced by the steady, pervasive warmth of the radiant heating under the dark wood floors. She slept for 12 hours at a time, waking only to eat and stare out at the white void where the city used to be. She was recovering. The hollow look in her cheeks was filling out, the dark circles under her eyes fading to faint shadows. Her hair, washed and brushed, fell in soft waves around her shoulders, no longer the matted mess of a desperate woman. But with the return of her physical strength came a returning sharpness of mind, and with it, the realization of exactly where she was. She was in the lion's den. Luca Moretti did not stop working just because the city had stopped moving. Evie watched him from the periphery, curled up on the expansive gray sofa with a book she was pretending to read. Luca paced the length of the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, switching effortlessly between English and a rapid fire, liquid Italian that sounded both beautiful and menacing. "I do not care about the weather." Luca said into the phone, his voice level but carrying a weight that made Evie flinch. If the shipment sits at the docks, the frost will ruin it. Pay the union foreman double. Get it moved. He would hang up, rub the bridge of his nose, and immediately dial another number. Evie saw the violence simmering just beneath the surface of his tailored shirts. It was in the set of his jaw, the controlled economy of his movements. He was a man who managed chaos, a man who held a violent world together through sheer force of will. Yet she saw other things too. She saw him pause in the middle of a negotiation to text his driver, telling him to stay home with his pregnant wife rather than risk the icy roads. She heard him on the phone with a lieutenant, asking about a sick child, his voice dropping the hard edge to become surprisingly human. "Send the doctor to his house," Luca ordered quietly. "Put it on my personal account, and make sure the family has groceries." He was a paradox, a monster who protected his own, and for reasons Evie could not fathom, she was currently counted among his own. By the afternoon of the fourth day, the inactivity began to itch at Evie's skin. She felt useless, a parasite absorbing heat and food without offering anything in return. The condo was spotless, maintained by a cleaning service that obviously could not make it through the storm, but there were small things she could do. She found Luca in the living room, staring at a tablet with a frown etched between his brows. "I want to cook," she announced. Luca looked up, blinking as if pulling himself back from a great distance. "Excuse me? I want to cook dinner," Evie said, her voice wavering slightly but gaining strength. "We've been eating takeout leftovers and sandwiches for 3 days. You have a kitchen that costs more than my life, and it is full of food. Let me make something." Luca studied her. He looked at the oversized sweater she was wearing, one of his, the sleeves rolled up to reveal her wrists and the determination in her whiskey-colored eyes. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know," Evie replied. "I want to. Please, it is the least I can do." Luca hesitated, then shrugged, a gesture of elegant surrender. "The kitchen is yours." Evie went to work. It was a relief to have a task, to use her hands for something other than shivering. She raided the massive refrigerator and found fresh vegetables, herbs, and a package of chicken. She moved through the kitchen with the muscle memory of her years as a waitress and a line cook, chopping, sautéing, and seasoning. The scent of garlic, rosemary, and roasting chicken soon filled the sterile air of the penthouse, replacing the smell of leather and ozone with something warm and domestic. Luca wandered in an hour later, drawn by the smell. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. He had shed his jacket and tie, his shirt unbuttoned at the top, looking tired but relaxed. "It smells like my grandmother's house on a Sunday," he commented. Evie smiled, stirring a pot of sauce. "That is a high compliment, I assume." "The highest," Luca said, pushing off the doorframe and walking toward the island. He did not leave. He stayed in the kitchen, ostensibly to get a glass of wine, but he lingered. The space was large, yet as they moved around the island, the air between them seemed to compress. Evie reached for the salt. Luca reached for a glass. They bumped hips, a soft, accidental collision that sent a jolt of electricity through Evie's side. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping back. Luca did not step back. He stayed in her personal space, his presence heavy and magnetic. "You are nimble," he noted, watching her maneuver a hot pan. "You learn to be quick when you work the dinner rush," Evie said, flashing a small grin. "If you are slow, you get burned." "I will keep that in mind," Luca said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He offered to help chop the vegetables for the side dish. Evie hesitated, amused by the idea of a mafia boss doing prep work, but she handed him a knife. "Do not cut yourself," she teased. "I know how to handle a knife, Evie." He replied dryly. "Famous last words," she retorted. The banter was easy, light, a bridge building over the dark waters of their circumstances. For a moment, they were just two people making dinner while the world outside ended. Then, the inevitable happened. Distracted by Evie reaching across him to grab a towel, Luca's hand slipped, the knife bit into the fleshy part of his palm. He hissed a curse in Italian, dropping the knife. Evie gasped. She abandoned the stove instantly, rushing to his side. "Let me see." "It is nothing," Luca said, clutching his hand. "A scratch. Let me see," she insisted, her voice firm. She took his wrist, her hands small and cool against his hot skin, and pulled him toward the sink. She turned on the cold water and forced his hand under the stream. The blood swirled away, red against the stainless steel. It was not a deep cut, but it was bleeding freely. Evie focused entirely on the wound, her brow furrowed in concentration. She turned off the water and grabbed a clean towel, pressing it gently against his palm. "Hold this," she instructed. She reached for the first aid kit she had seen earlier in the pantry. She worked quickly, efficient and tender. She cleaned the cut with antiseptic, ignoring his sharp intake of breath, and began to wrap a bandage around his hand. She was standing inside the circle of his arms. Her face was level with his chest. She could smell him, soap, the crisp scent of his shirt, and the underlying warmth of the man himself. She secured the bandage with a small metal clip and smoothed her thumb over the back of his hand. A lingering, unconscious caress. "There," she said softly, her eyes still on his hand. "You will live." She looked up. Luca was staring at her. His face was inches from hers. The humor was gone from his eyes, replaced by something raw, dark, and terrifyingly intense. He was not looking at the bandage. He was looking at her mouth. Evie's breath hitched in her throat. She should move. She should step back and check the chicken. But her feet felt rooted to the floor. Luca's uninjured hand came up slowly. He brushed a damp strand of hair away from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers trailed down the line of her jaw, rough skin against soft, tracing the pulse that hammered frantically in her neck. "Evie," he whispered. The way he said her name sounded like a question and a claim all at once. Evie trembled. Her hands, still holding his injured one, curled into the fabric of his shirt. She did not pull away. Luca leaned in. He moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to run, to push him away, to say no. He paused a breath away from her lips, his dark eyes searching hers for panic. He found none, only a wide-eyed, breathless anticipation. He closed the distance. His lips were firm, warm, and tasting of wine. It was not a frantic clash of teeth. It was a slow, deliberate exploration. He kissed her as if he were memorizing the shape of her mouth. He tested her, pressing gently, waiting for her response. Evie let out a soft sound, a whimper of surrender, and opened her mouth to him. The kiss deepened instantly. Luca groaned low in his throat, a vibration Evie felt against her chest. His arm swept around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard body. He felt solid, immovable, a rock in the storm. Evie melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest to grip his shoulders, holding on as if he were the only thing keeping her upright. His hand on her lower back moved in slow, possessive circles, his thumb digging into the soft curve of her spine. Heat flared through Evie, hot and heavy, chasing away the last memory of the cold. For a moment, there was no Mafia, no homelessness, no danger. There was only the taste of him, the strength of his arms, and the overwhelming feeling of being wanted. Luca pulled back slowly, reluctantly. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. Evie's eyes fluttered open, dazed and dark. She stared at him, her lips swollen, her heart racing. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on her. She stammered, stepping back, her hand flying to her mouth. Luca watched her, his eyes blazing. He did not apologize. "I do not want to be something you own," Evie blurted out. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, born of her deepest fear. "I am not a car. I am not a building. You cannot just keep me." Luca straightened. The vulnerability in his expression hardened, sealing over like ice on a lake. He crossed his arms, the bandage on his hand stark white against his shirt. "I do not do things halfway. Evie," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, low register. He took a step toward her. She held her ground, though every instinct told her to flee. "If you are here, you are under my protection," Luca said. "You are my responsibility. And yes, that means you are mine. I protect what is mine. I care for what is mine." He reached out, grabbing her chin gently but firmly, tilting her face up. "But I am not a jailer. When the road's clear, If you want to leave, I will open the door for you. I will give you money. I will send you wherever you want to go." He searched her eyes, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "But until then, do not pretend this is not happening. Do not pretend you do not feel it." He released her abruptly and turned away, walking toward the wine rack. "Check the chicken," he threw over his shoulder. "It is burning." Evie stood trembling in the middle of the kitchen, her lips still tingling from his kiss. She turned to the stove, her hands shaking as she turned off the burner. She felt it, God help her. She felt it, and that was what terrified her most. Dinner was a quiet affair. The banter was gone, replaced by a thick, charged silence. They ate the food Evie had cooked, the domesticity of the meal at war with the electric tension crackling between them. Later that night, the wind outside seemed to pick up, howling with renewed fury. Evie retreated to her room early, claiming a headache. She lay in the dark, replaying the kiss, replaying his words, "You are mine." Around midnight, she grew thirsty. She crept out of her room, intending to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The hallway was dark, but a sliver of light spilled from the crack under the door of Luca's study. She heard voices, low, urgent voices. She hesitated. She knew she should not listen, but the tone of the conversation stopped her. "It is a mistake, boss," a rough voice said. Evie recognized it as Marco, one of the older guards, the one who looked at her with cold, dead eyes. "I did not ask for your opinion." "Marco," Luca's voice replied, sharp and icy. "You need to hear it," Marco insisted. "The Santoro family is moving. We have chatter that they are looking for a way in. They know you are holed up here. They know you are distracted. I am not distracted," Luca snapped. "You have a stray sleeping down the hall," Marco said, his voice rising slightly. "A girl we know nothing about. She shows up in an alley. Coincidentally, right where you are? In a blizzard?" "It was an accident," Luca said. "She is a civilian, or she is a plant," Marco countered. "A honeypot. The Santoros are not above using a pretty face to get close to you. She's been here 4 days. She's cooking your food. She's listening to your calls. If she is feeding them information—" "She is not," Luca said. But there was a hesitation in his voice that cut Evie to the bone. "You cannot know that for sure," Marco pressed. "And even if she is innocent, she is a weakness. You are worrying about her. You are checking on her. If the Santoros find out she is here, they will use her to get to you. She is a liability. Luca, a dangerous one." Silence stretched in the hallway. Evie pressed her hand over her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. She felt the blood drain from her face. A liability. A weakness. A plant. She waited for Luca to defend her. She waited for him to shout Marco down, to say that he trusted her. "I will handle it," Luca said finally. His voice was weary, devoid of the fire he had shown in the kitchen. "You need to get rid of her," Marco said. "As soon as the snow stops, put her on a bus. Or—" "That is enough," Luca barked. "Get out!" Evie scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned and fled silently back to her room, closing the door just as she heard the study door open. She threw herself onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow to stifle a sob. The warmth of the kiss, the feeling of safety, the illusion of belonging, it all shattered. To Luca, she might be a curiosity, maybe even something he desired. But to his world, she was a threat. She was a vulnerability that could get him killed. Marco was right. She did not belong here. She was a homeless waitress with nothing to offer but danger. She was not a guest. She was a pet in a gilded cage, and soon she would be the reason the wolves came to the door. She sat up, wiping her tears. She looked at the window. The snow was still falling, but the wind had died down slightly. She could not stay. If she stayed, she would either be thrown out when he got tired of her, or she would be the weapon used to destroy him. "I have to leave," she whispered to the empty room. The thought made her chest ache with a physical pain, but she held on to it. She would not be a weakness. She would not be a liability. She would disappear, just as she had appeared, before she destroyed the only man who had ever tried to keep her. The sun finally broke through on the fifth morning, a pale, watery disk hanging in a sky the color of bruised iron. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving Northbridge buried under 3 feet of silence that was quickly being shattered by the roar of plow trucks and the frantic digging of a city trying to remember how to function. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere had shifted from the suspended animation of the storm to the sharp, frantic energy of a war room. Luca was no longer the man in the kitchen with a glass of wine. He was the boss again. He had been up since 4 in the morning, pacing the length of the living room, his voice a low, continuous rumble as he issued orders into his phone. The Santoro family had used the cover of the storm to move product into the southern districts, encroaching on territories that had belonged to the Moretti family for 2 generations. The ceasefire, fragile as ice, had shattered along with the weather. Evie watched him from the hallway shadows. He was dressed in a fresh suit, charcoal gray and razor sharp, his hair perfectly styled, his injured hand flexing stiffly as he spoke. He looked powerful. He looked untouchable. He looked like a man who did not have time for a stray girl with a backpack full of borrowed clothes. She retreated to the guest room, her heart feeling like a heavy stone in her chest. She had heard Marco's words the night before. She knew what she was: a liability, a weakness, a target. If she stayed, she would be the chink in Luca's armor that his enemies would exploit. And worse, she would be waiting for the day Luca realized it himself and asked her to leave. She would not wait for that. She would not let him look at her with regret. Evie grabbed the canvas backpack she had found in the closet. She packed the few items she had: the sweatpants, the thick socks, a spare shirt. She hesitated at the bathroom counter, looking at the expensive moisturizer he had told her to use, then left it. She would take only what she needed to survive. She slipped the cash he had left on the dresser into her pocket, $200. It felt like stealing, but the alternative was starving, and she had promised herself she would survive. She dressed in the jeans she had arrived in, now washed and dried but still stiff, and pulled on her old coat. It felt thin compared to the luxury of the last few days. She laced up her boots, her fingers trembling. She took a deep breath, scanning the room one last time. The bed was made. The room was pristine. It was as if she had never been there. That is how it should be, she whispered to herself. She opened the bedroom door and crept into the hallway. She could hear Luca in the study, his voice raised in anger as he berated someone on the other end of the line. "Find them," he snapped. "I want to know who authorized the drop." Evie used the sound of his voice as cover. She moved quickly toward the front door, her boots silent on the expensive rugs. She reached the entryway, her hand hovering over the heavy brass handle. Freedom was on the other side, the cold, hard, lonely freedom she was used to. She gripped the handle and turned it. The latch clicked. "Going somewhere?" The voice came from behind her, low and deceptively calm. Evie froze. The blood drained from her face. She did not turn around immediately, her hand still gripping the door handle as if it were a lifeline. "I asked you a question." "Evie." She slowly released the handle and turned. Luca was standing at the entrance to the living room. He had ended his call. His phone was clutched in his hand, his knuckles white, his eyes were dark, unreadable, fixed on the backpack slung over her shoulder and the coat buttoned to her chin. I thought it was time," Evie stammered, her voice thin. "The storm is over. The plows are out." Luca walked toward her. He moved with a slow, predatory grace that made the large entryway feel suddenly claustrophobic. "So you were just going to leave?" he asked. "No goodbye, no note. Just slip out the door like a thief in the night?" "I am not a thief," Evie said, lifting her chin, defensive pride flaring up to cover her hurt. "I took nothing that wasn't mine. I left the clothes." He stopped 3 feet from her. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood and cold air, washed over her. "You took the food I gave you," Luca said, his voice dropping. "You took the heat. You took the safety. And now you think you can just walk back out there? Into that?" He gestured vaguely at the door. "At the city beyond. I do not belong here." "Luca," Evie said, her voice shaking, "look at this place. Look at you. And look at me. I am a waitress who sleeps in alleys. I am not part of this. You are part of this because I said you are, Luca countered, his jaw tightening. Because you own me? Evie threw the words at him, the memory of his claims stinging. I heard you tell your men I was yours, but I am not a thing. Luca, I am not a car you found or a building you bought. I cannot just sit on a shelf waiting for you to come home. I never said you were a thing, Luca growled, stepping closer, invading her space. You said you were keeping me, Evie cried out, backing up until her shoulders hit the solid wood of the door. But for how long? Until you get bored. Until your enemies find out. I heard Marco. I know what they think. They think I am a weakness. They think I will get you killed. Luca's expression shattered. The anger vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine shock. You heard Marco? He asked softly. I heard enough, Evie said, tears pricking her eyes. I will not be the reason you get hurt, and I will not wait around for you to resent me. I am doing us both a favor. She reached for the door handle again, desperate to escape before she broke down completely. No, Luca said. He moved faster than she could react. He slammed his hand against the door above her head, holding it shut. He did not touch her, but he caged her in, his body looming over hers, blocking out the light, the room, everything but him. You are not leaving, he said, his voice rough. Get out of my way, Evie whispered, staring at his chest, refusing to look at his eyes. You think you are saving me? Luca asked, leaning down, forcing her to hear the raw edge in his voice. You think you're doing me a favor by walking back out into a city that chews people up and spits them out? Do you have any idea what happens to women like you out there? The Santoros are moving. The streets are going to be a war zone. If you walk out that door, you will be dead or worse within 48 hours. I can take care of myself, Evie insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. No, you cannot, Luca roared, the control finally snapping. You were freezing to death in my car. Evie, you were dying. The silence that followed was deafening. Evie trembled, her breath hitching. Luca lowered his head until his forehead was almost touching hers. His breathing was ragged, as if he had run a mile. You do not understand, he whispered, the anger bleeding out into something desperate and terrifyingly honest. I have not slept in 4 nights. Evie looked up, startled. What? I have not slept, Luca confessed, his dark eyes searching hers, stripping away her defenses layer by layer. Every night, I lie awake listening to the hallway, listening for your breathing, listening for the floorboards to creak. I am terrified that if I close my eyes, I will wake up and the silence will be back. I am terrified that you will be gone. Evie stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. You were listening for me. I have been alone in this penthouse for 5 years, Luca said, his voice thick with emotion. It is a fortress. It is cold and it is quiet. And it is exactly what I thought I wanted. Until you broke into my car. He raised his hands slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, and cupped her face. His palms were warm, his thumbs brushing away the tear that had escaped her eye. You are not a weakness, Evie, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. You are the only thing in this God-forsaken city that makes me feel like a man and not a machine. Do not leave me, please. The plea broke her. It shattered her resolve, her fear, her logic. Evie let out a sob and dropped her backpack. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. I am scared, she whispered. I know. Luca breathed. I am too. He didn't wait for permission this time. He didn't need to. Evie's hands were already reaching for him, gripping the lapels of his suit jacket, pulling him down. Their mouths met with a crash of desperation. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't the tentative test of the kitchen. It was a collision of 2 people who had been starving for years. Luca groaned against her lips, a guttural sound of relief and hunger, his arms wrapping around her waist to haul her up against him. Evie gasped, opening to him, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She tasted coffee and mint and the unique, intoxicating flavor of him. He kissed her like he was trying to breathe for her, deep and consuming, his tongue sweeping into her mouth to claim her completely. Luca backed her against the door. his hips pressing hers into the wood. The backpack was kicked aside. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his body, the roughness of his hands sliding down her back to cup her curves, pulling her flush against the hard ridge of his desire. "I want this," Evie whispered against his lips, her voice breathless and sure. "I want you." Luca pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes wild and dilated. "Are you sure?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. "If we do this, there is no going back to the guest room. There is no going back to strangers." "I do not want to go back," Evie said. Luca let out a shuddering breath. He swept her up into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Evie wrapped her legs around his waist, burying her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling him. He carried her down the hallway, past the study, past the guest room, to the double doors at the end, his bedroom. He kicked the door open and carried her into the sanctuary of his private life. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the morning sun. He lowered her onto the massive bed, following her down, his weight a heavy welcome blanket. His hands were everywhere, frantic and adoring. He pulled the coat from her shoulders, tossing it to the floor. His fingers fumbled with the buttons of her shirt, his touch searing her skin. Evie's hands worked on his tie, pulling it loose, unbuttoning his shirt to reveal the broad, scarred expanse of his chest. Skin met skin, hot and electric. Luca paused, bracing himself on his elbows above her. He looked down at her, his expression raw with awe. He traced the line of her throat, her collarbone, the curve of her breast, his touch reverent. "You are beautiful," he whispered, as if it were a secret he had been keeping. Evie reached up, framing his face with her hands, pulling him down. "Show me," she murmured. The rest of the world fell away. There were no words left, only the language of bodies moving together, of sighs and gasps and the friction of skin. It was a reclaiming. Luca touched her not as a boss, not as a savior, but as a man who had found the missing piece of his soul, and Evie, who had spent so long making herself invisible, finally allowed herself to be seen, completely and utterly, in the arms of the only man who had ever looked at her and promised to keep her. Evie woke slowly, drifting up from the deepest sleep she had ever known. The room was dim, lit only by the slivers of light escaping the edges of the heavy velvet curtains. The bed was an island of warmth. She shifted, realizing she was not alone. A heavy arm was draped across her waist, holding her pinned to the mattress. Luca was asleep beside her, his face buried in her hair, his breathing deep and even. For a moment, Evie just lay there, letting the reality sink in. She was safe. She was warm. She was wanted. The memories of the night before washed over her, the tenderness, the intensity, the way he had whispered her name like a prayer in the dark. It felt like a dream, something too good to be true for a girl who was used to nightmares. She turned her head carefully, trying not to wake him. She looked at his face, relaxed in sleep, the lines of stress smoothed away. He looked younger, less dangerous. Then her eyes drifted past him to the nightstand. There, sitting on the polished mahogany surface next to a crystal glass of water, was a black handgun. It was matte black, ugly and efficient. It lay there like a coiled snake, a silent reminder of who he was and the world he lived in. The warm glow in Evie's chest chilled slightly. She pulled the sheet higher, suddenly feeling exposed. This was his reality. He slept with a weapon within arm's reach. He lived in a world where death could come through the door at any moment, and now she was in that bed, in that world. Luca stirred. His arm tightened around her, pulling her back against his chest. He made a low, content sound in his throat and buried his face in the crook of her neck. "Good morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Good morning," Evie whispered, forcing her eyes away from the gun. Luca propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her. He smiled, a genuine, sleepy smile that made her heart ache. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her nose. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I am good," Evie said, Better than I have been in a long time. Good, Luca said. Stay that way. He leaned down to kiss her properly, a slow, lingering kiss that promised more. But the moment was shattered by a sharp vibration. Luca's phone, sitting on the nightstand next to the gun, buzzed angrily against the wood. Luca pulled back, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. He ignored it for a second, looking back at Evie, but the buzzing persisted. 2 short bursts, a message. He sighed and rolled over, reaching for the phone. I have to check. It might be the docs. He picked up the device, the screen lighting up his face in the dim room. Evie watched him. She saw his body go rigid. The relaxed, sleepy lover vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, hard statue she had met in the car. His hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. Luca? Evie asked, sitting up, clutching the sheet to her chest. What is it? Luca did not answer. He stared at the screen, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of rage and horror. He slowly turned the phone toward her. Evie leaned forward. It was a photo message. The image was grainy, taken from a distance with a zoom lens. It showed a street corner. In the center of the frame was Evie. She was wearing her old coat, looking down at the ground, her shoulders hunched against the cold. It must have been taken days ago, maybe the day before the blizzard, when she was still wandering the streets. But it was the caption beneath the photo that made Evie's blood turn to ice. Nice stray you picked up. Moretti? She looks cold. Maybe we should warm her up for you. Evie slapped a hand over her mouth, a gasp stuck in her throat. They know, she whispered. Luca lowered the phone. He looked at her, and the fear in his eyes was not for himself. It was for her. They know, he confirmed, his voice deadly quiet. He looked at the gun on the nightstand, then back at Evie. The sanctuary was breached. The secret was out. The Santoro family knew he had a weakness, and they had just painted a target on her back. I am sorry, Luca said, and the apology sounded like a goodbye to peace. He reached out and grabbed the gun, sliding it out of its holster and checking the chamber with a metallic click that echoed in the silent room. Get dressed. Evie, he commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth. We are going to war. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted instantly, snapping from the warm, hazy intimacy of a lover's sanctuary to the cold, sterile tension of a command center. The transition was jarring, like waking from a pleasant dream to find a knife pressed against one's throat. Luca Moretti was no longer the man who had whispered confessions of loneliness in the dark. He was the boss again, a creature of iron and calculation, and the change terrified Evie almost as much as the threat from the Santoro family. Security was tightened immediately. The quiet solitude of the condo was shattered by the arrival of more men. Marco, the older guard who had called Evie a liability, was stationed permanently outside the front door, his presence a grim reminder of her precarious position. Another guard, Danny, a younger man with eyes that missed nothing, was assigned to the lobby. Luca became a ghost in his own home. He spent hours in his study with the door locked, speaking in low, rapid Italian. When he emerged, he was distracted, his eyes constantly scanning the windows, the doors, the shadows. He stopped touching her in the open, the casual brushes of hands in the kitchen, the stolen kisses in the hallway. They all vanished, replaced by a rigid, professional distance that made Evie feel cold despite the heating. You are not to leave the building, Luca told her the morning after the threat arrived. He was adjusting his cufflinks, staring into the mirror, refusing to meet her eyes. Marco will bring whatever you need, food, clothes, anything. You stay inside. Evie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the sheets. I cannot just sit here. Luca. It is not a request, Luca said, his voice flat. It is an order. For 2 days. Evie tried to comply. She paced the expansive living room, watched the city recover from the blizzard through the glass, and tried to make herself invisible as armed men moved through the space. But the inactivity was suffocating. She was a survivor. She was used to moving, to working, to fighting for her next meal. Being trapped in a golden cage, even for her own safety, felt like a slow death. On the 3rd day, she snapped. She found Luca in the kitchen, Pouring a coffee he looked too wired to drink. "I need a job," she announced. Standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, Luca slowly lowered the mug. "We have discussed this. It is too dangerous. I am not a prisoner." "Luca," Evie argued, her voice rising, "I understand the danger. I saw the photo. But I cannot spend the rest of my life hiding behind locked doors, waiting for someone to shoot me. I need to do something. I need to feel like a person again, not just something you are guarding." Luca turned to face her, his expression hard. "You want to go out there? Where they are hunting you?" "I want a life," Evie shot back. "I want to earn my own money. I want to look people in the eye. I want to reclaim some dignity. You gave me safety, and I am grateful. But this is just another kind of homelessness. I am just squatting in a nicer place." Luca looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in days. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the same fierce will that had made her break into his car to survive. He realized then that he could keep her body safe by locking her up, but he would destroy her spirit in the process. He set the mug down. "Fine," he said. Evie blinked, surprised by the sudden capitulation. "Fine? I will handle it," Luca said. "But we do it my way." His way involved layers of deception that made Evie's head spin. Within 24 hours, Luca had produced a manila envelope. Inside was a birth certificate for a woman named Evie Miller, a social security card, and a resume that listed 3 years of waitressing experience at a diner in a neighboring state that had conveniently burned down a month ago, making verification impossible. There was also $500 in small bills. "There is a place in the West End," Luca explained, sliding the envelope across the island to her. "It is a family diner called Rivera's. It is in a neutral territory, quiet, mostly locals. The owner owes me a favor, but she does not know who you are. To her, you are just a girl looking for work." Evie picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling. It felt heavy. It felt like freedom. "Danny will drive you," Luca added, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He will sit in the car or at a back booth. You do not go anywhere without him. If you see anything suspicious, you drop everything and you run to him. Do you understand?" "I understand," Evie whispered, clutching the envelope to her chest. "Thank you." The interview was the most terrifying thing Evie had done since the night of the blizzard. She wore a simple black blouse and slacks that Luca had ordered for her, clothes that fit perfectly and made her look respectable, like a woman who had never slept on a steam grate. Mrs. Rivera was a formidable woman in her 60s with hair dyed a defiant shade of red and eyes that had seen everything. She sat across from Evie in a vinyl booth, reading the fake resume. Evie's hands shook in her lap. She clamped them together, trying to stop the tremors. "There is a gap here." "Mrs." Rivera noted, tapping a manicured fingernail on the paper. 6 months. What were you doing then?" Evie's throat went dry. This was the test. She could not say she was homeless. She could not say she was living in a mafia boss's penthouse. I had some family trouble," Evie lied, the words tasting like ash. "I had to take care of a sick relative. It took everything I had, but they are gone now. And I really need this job. Mrs. Rivera, I am a hard worker. I am fast, I am clean, and I do not complain." She looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze. The desperation in her voice was real. The hunger to work was real. "Mrs." Rivera studied her face. She saw the nervousness, but she also saw the steel beneath it. She saw a girl who was trying to climb out of a hole. "You have good eyes." "Mrs." Rivera decided, closing the folder. "You start tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Do not be late." Evie let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a year. "Thank you. You will not regret it." Working at the diner changed everything. For 8 hours a day. Evie was not the mafia boss's secret weakness. She was just Evie, the girl with the coffee pot. She relearned the rhythm of the lunch rush, the weight of heavy plates, the ache in her feet that felt satisfying because it was earned. She came home to the penthouse that first evening exhausted, smelling of grease and maple syrup, but she was glowing. Luca was waiting for her on the sofa. He had loosened his tie and discarded his jacket, a tumbler of whiskey resting on his knee. He watched her walk in, noting the color in her cheeks and the light in her eyes that had been missing for so long. "Tell me," he said. Evie dropped onto the cushion beside him, not caring that she smelled like a diner. "Oh, it was chaos," she said, laughing. "The toaster broke twice. There is this regular Mr. Henderson who insists his eggs must be scrambled for exactly 60 seconds. No more, no less. And I dropped a tray of water glasses, but Mrs. Rivera just laughed and told me it was good luck. She talked for 20 minutes, recounting the mundane details of her day as if they were epic adventures." Luca listened to every word. He did not care about Mr. Henderson or the toaster. He cared about the way her hands moved when she described the kitchen. He cared about the way she smiled when she pulled a wad of small bills, her tips, from her pocket and counted them on the coffee table. $32. It was nothing to him. He spent more than that on a single cigar. But to her, it was a fortune. It was hers. He watched her, hiding his delight behind the rim of his glass. She was coming back to life, and he had given that to her. Their romance deepened in the quiet spaces between his war and her work. It became domestic, grounded in the small rituals of survival and comfort. One afternoon, a week into her new job, the bell above the diner door jingled. Evie looked up from wiping the counter and froze. Luca walked in. He looked wildly out of place. He was wearing a navy suit that cost more than the diner made in a month, his dark coat draped over his arm. Danny was a few steps behind him, looking tense, but Luca moved with an easy, arrogant confidence. The chatter in the diner died down as people instinctively recognized a predator in their midst. Luca ignored them. He walked straight to a corner booth and sat down. Evie hurried over, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart hammering. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "It is not safe." "I was in the neighborhood," Luca said smoothly, picking up the laminated menu. "I hear the coffee is acceptable." "You cannot be here," Evie whispered, looking around nervously. Luca looked up at her, his dark eyes softening. "I wanted to see you." Evie felt a flush rise from her neck to her hairline. She bit her lip, fighting a smile. "Coffee," she said, trying to sound professional. "And do not order the meatloaf. Trust me." She brought him coffee. She served him a slice of cherry pie. Every time she passed his booth, she felt his eyes on her, heavy and warm. He watched her work, watched her banter with the customers, watched her move through the room with grace. When she refilled his cup, her hand brushed his on the table. He caught her fingers for a second, a secret squeeze that made her knees weak, before letting her go. That night, the tension of the day melted into something sweeter. Evie was sitting on the couch, counting her tips again. When Luca took the money from her hands and set it aside, he pulled her into his lap. Evie went willingly, curling her legs around him, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her tight, burying his face in the curve of her neck. "You smell like sugar," he murmured, inhaling deeply. "And you smell like expensive scotch," Evie teased, running her fingers through the hair at the nape of his neck. Luca tightened his grip. "Stay like this," he whispered, "just for a minute." They stayed like that for an hour, holding on to the fragile peace of the moment, pretending the world outside wasn't trying to tear them apart. But the world always found a way in. 2 days later, a young police officer came into the diner. He was new to the beat, handsome in a clean-cut way, with a badge gleaming on his chest. He sat at the counter, and Evie poured his coffee with her usual smile. "New in town?" she asked politely. "Just transferred," the officer said, grinning at her. "Name is Officer Miller, and I have to say, the service here is the best I have seen in the city." He was flirting. It was harmless, casual, the kind of banter Evie dealt with 10 times a day. He complimented her work ethic, made a joke about the weather, and left a generous tip. Evie laughed at something he said, a genuine, ringing laugh, from the back booth where he had been sitting quietly reviewing documents. Luca watched. His hand crushed the paper napkin he was holding. He saw the way the cop looked at her. He saw the way Evie smiled, and a dark, ugly spike of jealousy drove itself into his chest. It was irrational. He knew that, but the sight of another man, especially a man who represented the law, the other side of the line, making her laugh made him want to burn the city down. That evening, the ride home was silent. When they got into the penthouse, Luca did not go to his study. He followed Evie into the bedroom. When she turned to ask him what was wrong, he crowded her against the dresser. He kissed her with a fierce, possessive intensity that bordered on rough. His hands roamed over her body, gripping her hips, claiming her, "You are mine." He growled against her mouth, "Do you understand? Mine." Evie tensed. For a second, the intensity scared her. It felt too close to the violence she saw him use on others. Luca felt her hesitation instantly. He pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He saw the flicker of fear in her gaze, and it was like a bucket of ice water. He released her, stepping back, running a hand over his face. "I am sorry," he rasped. "It is okay," Evie whispered, though her heart was racing. "Just do not look at me like I am one of your enemies. I could never," Luca said. But the shadow remained in his eyes. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Luca received a call at 2 a.m. He left the bed without waking Evie and went to the living room. Marco was waiting for him, his face grim. They hit the warehouse on the waterfront. Marco reported. Firebombed it. 2 men in the hospital. Luca cursed, pacing the room. The inventory? Gone. But that is not the message. Boss. Marco held out a piece of paper. It had been found pinned to the charred remains of the warehouse door with a knife. It was a printed note. "The heat is rising. How long until the girl who warms your bed gets burned?" Luca stared at the paper. The words swam before his eyes. They were not just watching her anymore. They were actively using her to taunt him. They were circling closer. Every minute she spent at the diner, every minute she spent in this condo, she was a leverage point. If they took her, they would break him. He knew it, and they knew it. He looked down the hall toward the bedroom where Evie was sleeping, safe and warm in his sheets. He loved her. The realization was a physical pain. He loved her enough to die for her, but he had to love her enough to let her go. He could not protect her here. Not anymore. The walls were breached. The only way to save her life was to remove the target from her back, and the target was him. Luca made the decision. It felt like cutting out his own heart, but he did not hesitate. He walked into the bedroom and turned on the overhead light. Evie woke with a start, blinking in the sudden brightness. "Luca? Get up," Luca said. His voice was cold, hard, the voice of the boss. Evie sat up, pulling the sheet around her, confusion clouding her face. "What is happening? Is it the Centauros?" "Get your things," Luca said, tossing a duffel bag onto the bed. Evie stared at the bag. "What? Where are we going?" "We're not going anywhere," Luca said, standing by the door, refusing to look at her. "You are leaving." Evie felt a cold pit open in her stomach. "Leaving? Why? Luca, you are scaring me. It was a mistake," Luca said. He forced himself to look at her, forced his face into a mask of indifference. "Bringing you here, playing house. It was a mistake." Evie scrambled out of bed, ignoring her nakedness, reaching for her robe. No, you do not mean that. I love you." Luca flinched internally, but outwardly he remained stone. "I am distracted, Evie," he said cruelly. "I am losing money. I am losing territory. My men are getting hurt because I am worried about a waitress. I cannot afford you anymore." "Afford me?" Evie gasped, the words striking her like physical blows. "Is that what I am? A luxury item, a distraction?" "You are a liability," Luca said, delivering the final, fatal lie. "And I am tired of it. I am tired of worrying. I want my life back." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. It was stuffed with cash, $10,000. "Take this," he said, placing it on the dresser. "Danny is waiting downstairs. He will drive you to the train station, go to Boston, go to Chicago. I do not care. Just go." Evie stood frozen in the center of the room. Her heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. She looked for the man who had held her on the couch, the man who had kissed her scars, the man who had said he was keeping her. He was gone. In his place was the monster everyone said he was. She did not scream. She did not fight. The old instinct for survival. cold and hard, rose up to protect her. She walked to the bed and picked up the clothes she had bought with her diner money. She dressed in silence, her hands steady, her eyes dry and burning. She packed her small bag. She did not take the money on the dresser. "Evie, take the money," Luca said, his voice cracking slightly. Evie slung her bag over her shoulder. She walked to the door. She stopped in front of him. She looked up into his eyes, searching for a trace of the lie, but he was too good at this. He was a professional liar. "I thought you were different," she whispered. "I thought I was safe." "You are safe now," Luca said, his voice barely audible. Evie shook her head. "No, I am just homeless again." She walked past him, down the hallway, and out the front door. Luca stood in the bedroom, listening to her footsteps recede. He heard the front door open and close. Only then did he let the mask fall. He sank onto the edge of the bed, putting his head in his hands. He gasped for air, his chest heaving with the effort of not running after her. He had saved her life, and he had destroyed his own. Part 6. The room was small, a 10 by 10 box with peeling wallpaper that smelled of mildew and old cigarettes. It was a far cry from the glass-walled penthouse overlooking the city, but it had a lock on the door and a radiator that rattled and hissed, spitting out enough heat to keep the frost off the windows. Evie Carter sat on the edge of the sagging twin mattress, counting out her tips from the diner. $48, added to her wages and the remainder of the cash from the envelope Luca had given her for the fake ID. She had enough for rent and groceries for another week. It was freedom. It was independence. It was exactly what she had argued for. So why did it feel like she was hollowing out from the inside? 2 weeks had passed since she walked out of Luca Moretti's life. She went to work at Rivera's diner every morning at 6. She poured coffee, she scrubbed tables, she smiled at customers, she went home to the boarding house, she ate instant noodles sitting on the floor. And every night, she stared at her cheap prepaid phone, her thumb hovering over the number she had memorized but never saved. She missed him with a physical ache that terrified her. She missed the safety of his presence, the rough warmth of his hands, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. But then she would remember the coldness in his eyes that last night, the way he had called her a liability, and her hand would drop. He did not want her. He had grown bored of the stray he had picked up. Calling him would only prove him right, that she was weak, that she could not survive without him. She shoved the money into her pocket and stood up. She would not call. She would survive. She had done it before, and she would do it again. Evie did not know that she was being watched. The Santoro family had been patient. They had eyes on the penthouse, on the warehouse district, on the known Moretti hangouts. When the black SUVs stopped escorting the woman with the brown hair, they noticed when Luca Moretti stopped coming home at reasonable hours and started tearing through the city with a reckless, angry energy. They noticed, they put the pieces together. The boss had cut the girl loose, but in their world, you did not just cut someone loose. If Moretti had let her go, it was not because he did not care. It was because he cared too much, and he was trying to hide her. They found her within 3 days. It was not hard. A woman working a diner shift, walking home to a boarding house in the South End. She was exposed. She was vulnerable. She was the perfect leverage. It was a Tuesday night, unseasonably cold, the wind carrying the bite of a fresh frost. Evie clocked out at 10, wrapping her scarf tight around her neck. "Be safe." "Evie misses," Rivera called out from the kitchen. "I will," Evie promised. She stepped out into the night, the bell jingling behind her. The street was quiet. She walked briskly, her head down, her boots crunching on the remnants of dirty snow. She took the shortcut through the alley behind the old textile factory, a path she had taken a dozen times. She was halfway down the narrow passage when a van pulled in at the far end, blocking the exit. The headlights blinded her. Evie froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned to run back the way she came, but 2 shadows detached themselves from the darkness of a recessed doorway. "Grab her," a voice rasped. Evie tried to scream, but a heavy, gloved hand clamped over her mouth before the sound could escape. She fought. She kicked backward, her boot connecting with a shin, earning a grunt of pain. She clawed at the arm across her chest, digging her nails in, but they were too strong. They were professionals. One of them lifted her off her feet while the other secured her arms. They dragged her toward the waiting van, her heels dragging through the slush. "Get her in!" They threw her into the back of the van. Evie scrambled to the corner, gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she begged, holding up her hands. "I have no money. I am just a waitress." The man who had grabbed her climbed in, slamming the door shut. He wore a ski mask, his eyes hard and mocking. "We do not want your tips. Sweetheart," he said, pulling a zip tie from his pocket. "You are going to buy us a whole lot more than that." He lunged for her. Evie struck out, slapping his face, but he caught her wrists easily, wrenching them behind her back. He secured the plastic tie with a brutal jerk that made her cry out. "Why?" she sobbed, as the van lurched into motion. "Why are you doing this?" The man pulled a roll of duct tape from his jacket. "Because Luca Moretti made a mistake," he said. "He thought he could hide his heart in a boarding house." The tape slapped over her mouth, silencing her scream, but the name echoed in her mind, turning her fear into a cold, heavy stone. Luca. They were using her to get to Luca. She had left to protect him, and by leaving, she had given them exactly what they needed to destroy him. Luca was in his study, nursing a glass of bourbon he had not touched in an hour. The penthouse was silent, a tomb of glass and steel. He had not slept properly since she left. He worked until his eyes burned. Then he sat in the dark and hated himself. His phone buzzed on the desk. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again, a persistent, demanding rhythm. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number. He swiped to answer. "Moretti," he said, his voice a gravelly warning. There was no voice on the other end, just a video feed connecting. Luca's blood ran cold. The image resolved. It was a dimly lit room, concrete walls, water dripping somewhere in the background. In the center of the frame, tied to a wooden chair, was Evie. Luca stopped breathing. The glass of bourbon slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, the sound exploding in the silence. Evie looked small. Her hair was messy, sticking to her tear-streaked face. There was a fresh, dark bruise forming on her cheekbone. Her mouth was taped shut, but her eyes, her whiskey-colored eyes, were wide with terrified recognition as she looked at the camera. "Hello?" "Luca." The voice came from behind the camera. It was smooth, taunting. It was Santoro. "I see you lost something," Santoro said. "We found her wandering in the cold. She looks lonely." "If you touch her," Luca whispered, a sound of pure, unadulterated violence. "I will kill everyone you have ever met." Santoro laughed. "Touches are expensive. Luca, but her life, that is going to cost you. We want the waterfront, all of it, the docks, the warehouses, the shipping routes. You sign it over by 3 a.m, or the girl disappears for good." He moved the camera closer to Evie. She flinched, making a muffled sound of distress. "You have 3 hours," Santoro said. "Do not keep us waiting." She is shivering. The screen went black. Luca stared at the phone, his hand shaking so hard the device vibrated. A roar of sound filled his ears, his own pulse. Hammering like a war drum, guilt crashed into him, a tidal wave of nausea and agony. He had done this. He had sent her away. He had told himself he was protecting her, but he had just stripped her of his protection. He had put her out on the street alone, right where the wolves could find her. He loved her. The truth hit him with the force of a bullet. He didn't just want her. He didn't just feel responsible for her. He loved her. He loved the way she fought, the way she cooked, the way she looked at him like he was a man and not a monster. He stood up, kicking the chair back so hard it fell over. "Marco! Danny!" His men burst into the room, guns drawn, reacting to the tone of his voice. "Get the car," Luca ordered, his voice devoid of humanity. "Get the rifles. Get everyone." "Boss?" Marco asked, lowering his weapon slightly. "What is it?" "They have her," Luca said, walking to the wall safe hidden behind a painting. He spun the dial with frantic precision. "They have Evie." Marco exchanged a look with Danny. "Luca," Marco said cautiously, It is a trap. You know it is a trap. They want the waterfront. If you give it to them, we are finished. And if you go in there—" "I am not giving them anything," Luca said, pulling a heavy tactical vest from the safe, "and I am not leaving her there. She is a civilian." "Luca," Marco pressed, stepping forward, "I told you she was a weakness. If you go after her, you risk the entire organization. You have to walk away. It is the only strategic move." Luca stopped. He turned to Marco. He held a semi-automatic rifle in one hand and a combat knife in the other. His eyes were black holes. "She is not a weakness," Luca said softly. "She's the only thing that matters." He strapped the vest on, the Velcro tearing loud in the room. "We are going to the old packing district. That is where the call came from." I recognized the background noise, the train tracks. He looked at his men. "I am going. If you are loyal, you come with me. If not, get out of my city before I get back." Marco looked at Luca, saw the absolute terrifying resolve in his face, and sighed. He racked the slide of his pistol. "We are loyal, boss." The warehouse was a fortress of shadows, sitting on the edge of the abandoned rail yards. Inside, the air was freezing. Evie shivered violently, her teeth chattering against the tape, her wrists burned where the zip ties dug into her skin. The bruise on her cheek throbbed in time with her heart. 2 men stood guard by the metal door. Another paced back and forth in front of her, the one who had taped her mouth. "He is not coming." "Sweetheart," the man sneered, "you are not worth the waterfront. No woman is." Evie closed her eyes. She tried to be brave, but the tears leaked out anyway. He was right. Luca had sent her away. He had chosen his business over her once. Why would he choose differently now? But she would not make it easy for them. She worked her jaw, chewing on the inside of the tape, trying to loosen the adhesive with saliva. She twisted her wrists, ignoring the pain, testing the plastic tie. It was tight, but the wood of the chair was splintered. If she could just rub the plastic against a sharp edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The hum of the overhead lamps died, plunging the warehouse into pitch darkness. "What the?" the guard shouted. "Check the breaker." There was a screech of tires outside, followed by a massive, deafening crash as a heavy truck rammed into the loading bay doors, crumpling the metal like paper. "It is a raid!" Someone screamed. Gunfire erupted. It was not the chaotic spray of gang violence. It was precise, controlled. 3 shots rang out from the darkness near the roof vents. Pop, pop, pop. And the 3 men near the door dropped before they could raise their weapons. Evie threw herself sideways, tipping the chair over. She hit the concrete hard, her shoulder taking the impact, but she was out of the line of fire. She curled into a ball, squeezing her eyes shut as the warehouse turned into a war zone. She heard footsteps, heavy, fast, running toward her. A hand grabbed the back of her chair. Evie screamed behind the tape, expecting a bullet. "Evie!" The voice was rough, frantic, and the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Luca. He was there. He was dressed in black tactical gear, his face smeared with grease, his eyes wild. He hauled the chair upright. He ripped the tape from her mouth. It stung, but she didn't care. "Luca," she sobbed, "behind you!" A shadow emerged from the gloom, the guard who had mocked her. He raised a pistol, aiming for Luca's back. Luca didn't look. He sensed the movement. He threw himself across Evie's body, shielding her with his own bulk just as the gun went off. The bullet sparked against the metal frame of the chair, inches from Evie's head. Luca roared. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. It was brutal and short. Luca moved with the efficiency of a machine, disarming the man and delivering a single, knockout blow with the butt of his rifle. Silence fell over the warehouse. "Clear!" Marco's voice echoed from the catwalks. Luca scrambled back to Evie. His hands, usually so steady, were shaking violently as he pulled a knife and sliced through the zip ties binding her wrists and ankles. As soon as she was free, Evie collapsed into him. She buried her face in his tactical vest, clutching handfuls of the heavy fabric, sobbing hysterically. "I thought you did not want me," she cried. "I thought you sent me away." Luca pulled her tight, wrapping his arms around her as if he could absorb her tremors into his own body. He buried his face in her hair, rocking her back and forth. "I was wrong," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I was so wrong. I thought I was saving you. I thought I could let you go." He pulled back, framing her face with his dirty, shaking hands. He looked at the bruise on her cheek, and his expression crumpled with a pain that was worse than any physical wound. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry. I should have never let you walk out that door." "You came for me," Evie whispered, touching his face to make sure he was real. "You came. I will always come for you." Luca promised. Always. They did not go back to the penthouse. It was compromised. It was part of the old life. They went to a safe house an hour north of the city, a modern cabin tucked away in the pine forests, far from the reach of the Santoros or the memories of the streets. 2 nights later, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a quiet, fragile peace. Luca and Evie sat on the balcony, wrapped together in a heavy wool blanket. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and snow. Below them, the distant lights of a small town twinkled, safe and far away. Evie leaned her head on Luca's shoulder. His arm was heavy around her, his hand resting possessively on her hip. "The Santoros?" she asked quietly. "Finished," Luca said. The tone was final. He did not elaborate, and Evie did not ask. She knew the war was over. He turned to look at her. The moonlight softened the sharp angles of his face. He looked tired, but the darkness that had haunted his eyes was gone, replaced by a steady, burning warmth. "Evie," he said. She looked up. "Yes?" "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen, because I am only going to say it once." He shifted, turning his body so he could face her fully. "I have spent my whole life building walls. I built an empire to keep people out. I thought that power was the only thing that kept me safe." He reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "But when I saw that video, when I saw you in that chair, I realized that none of it mattered. The money, the territory, the reputation, it was all ash. You were the only real thing I had." He squeezed her hand. "I love you, Evie. Not because you are mine to keep, but because you are the only person who sees me. You saw the man inside the monster, even when I tried to push you away." His voice dropped to a rough whisper. "I am keeping you now. No more fake names, no more diners, no more running. I am keeping you, but only if you want to stay." Evie looked at him. She saw the vulnerability he was offering her, the raw heart of a dangerous man laid bare in the moonlight. She thought of the cold streets, the loneliness, the fear, and then she thought of the warmth of his car, the soup in his kitchen, the way he had shielded her body with his own. She was not astray anymore. She was home. "I choose you," she whispered. "I choose to stay." Luca let out a breath, a sound of profound relief. He leaned in, and their lips met. It was not a kiss of hunger or desperation. It was a kiss of promise. It was slow and deep and tender, a seal on a pact made between 2 broken people who had found their jagged edges fit perfectly together. They sat there for a long time as the moon rose higher, holding onto each other, no longer alone in the blizzard, but warm, safe, and finally, truly kept. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Evie and Luca's journey kept you on the edge of your seat. I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your country or city in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Mafia Romance Stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode. And don't forget to share your thoughts on the ending in the comments. Did Luca make the right choice? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.